All right, welcome to Mad Media. This is Tony, and I'm here with Grimvera. Welcome, Grimvera.
Hey Tony, how are you?
Great, great. Yeah, so there's a few things that we wanted to discuss today, having to do with civilization and how people interact with it via their politics and their religion. And so we've put together some things that we want to discuss on that. And just to introduce the topic, I thought it would be apt to make a comparison between what we're going to discuss and biology. That beyond the history and beyond what people say, there's an underlying biological drive for a lot of things that I think is that it's worth noting. So most organisms have a natural method for establishing a foothold after parts break away to a new area, and it could be like spores for the fungi, or the male lion gets chased away by the pride to start his own pride. And Christianity has its missionaries performing a similar function, and it's a method for expanding a certain type of human on the earth. The missionaries usually accompany various military operations or commercial operations, and Islam and Judaism have analogs for it, although it's different. We could discuss later if it's relevant. But expansion is a risky and potentially fruitful activity. The biological function could be a way to renew certain parts of the species while others are dwindling. And on that, we mean to go over some of these types of events through history and into the modern day. So that's how I wanted to introduce the subject. And I think that there is some interesting things we can glean from kind of just doing a flyover of the timeline through history. And I think the timeline that we have is kind of an emphasis on Christians and their expansion. So would you like to introduce that, Grimvera?
Sure. The timeline, which we will also put a copy to up on the website mad.media.com, it has a very central focus on Christianity and its interaction with various pagan groups in the area, because it covers when the Roman Empire adopted it, and thus start the rapid spread of it across Europe. And it's inevitable that you will come across things that are less than tasteful sounding, things that kind of go against the grain. And I want to warn anybody who might be listening right off that we will be talking about things. I know for a fact I specifically will be mentioning things that might very well just outright piss people off. That's not intentional. It's just reporting on the parallels between the past and the present, and shining a light on the history of this thing called Christendom, which is supposed to be inherently white and pro-family, etc., etc. But it does fill a larger role in this idea that you mentioned, Tony, of biology, society, politics, spirituality, kind of all intersecting. They're all part of a whole, and while biology is part of it, it's more of a function that acts in these other three things. The three core things that we'll end up talking about overall are spirituality, and how it has always and will always have an effect on a society's ethics and their social structure and the general worldview. So, like I said, we'll be putting this timeline up on the website, and we'll be adding to it as our research discovers more and more and more. So, yeah, that's the meat of this very serious and uncomfortable subject that we'll be jumping into.
Yeah, that'll be a great resource for us to be able to reference and look at the timeline of stuff that especially that we think is relevant, because a lot of times when people are covering history, they're focusing more on things that are mainstream, or they're focusing on things that are more relevant to their particular movement and politics. So it will be interesting for us to kind of unravel over time the histories and what it means for people like us, people who are like-minded with us.
Right. And, I'm going to throw it out there now that as the timeline develops and everything, I won't object to anything being added to it that, even paints European pagans in a negative light. I mean, that's not the point. It's about just showing the truth of the matter, because you can't say one side or the other is completely and wholly good and the other is completely and wholly evil. Both sides play a part, and I want to, kind of maintain our integrity with that. And so anything that goes up on the timeline, we're going to take it very seriously and not try to play favorites when it comes to showing how the course of history has shaped itself.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. So when did when did the Christianity begin to get its foothold, and where?
Um, it first started in Armenia in 301 AD. Armenia became the first country that established Christianity as the state religion. When Saint Gregory the Illuminator manages to convince King Traidites III to convert. So it starts very, very early in history, as compared to other points. But it really starts gaining ground around 314 AD after it passes full legislation in the Roman Empire. And what you see immediately is this state-powered church attacking the indigenous religion that its society had before this point. The indigenous religion of the people that managed to make the Roman Empire so grandiose and widespread and expansive, for better or worse. And
Hmm.
this really starts happening when the Council of Ancyra denounces the worship of the goddess Artemis.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to see that it kind of gets its start in that particular area, Armenia, kind of being one of the places northeast of Africa, and there's some good seas, good sea travel, and I think there will be plenty of highlands around there for people to live in, and it's an interesting area, and Armenians are very prevalent throughout that entire area. When they do genetic tests, for example, like the Greeks and etc. It mostly turns up the people similar to Armenians, and that the Greek people themselves in the 1800s were speaking Armenian when they made touch with them over there. So it's an interesting area for the stage for this, to for people to start starting a new religion, and clunking people over the head when they don't go along.
Yeah, you see that even, and it's something that is prevalent in Abrahamic religions altogether, from Judaism to Christianity to Islam. This ultimate idea of convert or die, and you mainly start seeing it when populations of one of these religions reach a certain size, and this is something we'll go into later. But I think this is something that happened, during pre-Christianic times. I think it's what happened in the lands of Canaan, the Canaanites and the Jews coming in and genociding them out of existence so they can have this quote unquote holy land that their God promises them. They wipe out an entire people to claim a land as their own. And it's something that you see more or less repeated throughout history, even going to the present.
Yeah, and Constantine was a central figure in the beginning of the spread of Christianity, and there's lots of stories from the early parts of history there, where there are many different conquered groups around that time, the Hellenic people, and the expansion of Christianity throughout the empire. And it's not totally unprecedented. A lot of times, especially with Christianity, in the past few hundred years, we've seen parallels to this, where a group of Christians come along and discover a new place, and then the whole place, we don't know how long that they had been non-Christian. We don't know how long that they had been that way, and then overnight, boom, they're trying to convert the whole place. And for places like China, that meant that 50 to 100 million people had to die because they didn't want to do that, or some did and some didn't. They were conflicted about that. So, but sorry to diverge too far to the future, since we're going chronologically a bit through here. But yeah, Constantine is it says in the timeline that he ordered the oracle of Apollo ransacked, and the priests of Apollo executed. I don't know what Jesus would have done. I don't imagine that he would have been enthusiastic about non-Christians being around, but I don't know that he would order military men to forcefully destroy others. Do you know?
I'm not so sure that would have been met with disapproval, because you see church officials throughout history going all the way, through the Crusades, where they are bragging in letters back to Rome that they get men and brothers and whatnot to abandon their families. In fact, there's one fellow, I can't remember his name, but he even points out that he sees it as a point of pride that in this area where he was trying to get people to go fight for Christ, that it was 7 women to every 1 man. He was bragging about something that was decimating these populations. And then you see this kind of sentiment more or less reflected in the Bible, and it goes to through not even the Old Testament. You don't even have to have the Old Testament for this. This is all New Testament stuff. So anybody saying, well, that was just that's not really Christian, it's New Testament. For instance, and these are all taken from the King James Version, Matthew 19:29 says, "And everyone that hath forsaken houses, or brethren, or sisters, or father, or mother, or wife, or children, or lands, for my name's sake, shall receive a hundredfold, and shall inherit everlasting life." And you see this repeated again in Mark 10:29 through 30, where he says, "And Jesus answered and said, Verily I say unto you, there is no man that hath left house, or brethren, or sisters, or father, or mother, or wife, or children, or lands for my sake and the gospel's, but he shall receive a hundredfold now in this time, houses, and brethren, and sisters, and mothers, and children, and lands, with persecutions, and in the world become eternal life." Again, in Luke 14:26, if any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And then lastly, in Luke 18:29 through 30, and he said unto them, verily I say unto you, there is no man that hath left house or parents or brethren or wife or children for the kingdom of God's sake, who shall not receive manifold more in this present time and in the world to come life everlasting. So, these sentiments of he wouldn't approve of, what Constantine was doing, it's not a very it won't get very far, because you can look to the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke and see right there that it's all in favor of completely sundering a family for the sake of Christ and this promise of paradise after death.
Yeah, it sure is. And, this thought came to mind, that there are probably modern Christians who don't agree with what Constantine and the others did. Now, the people who have conquered, the people who we're talking about, like Constantine and the rest, they were the ones who spread Christianity. They were they were the people who called themselves Christian. And to the degree to which like some of the examples that you gave was about breaking apart the family in order to kind of throw yourself into Christianity and stuff like that. But it might be sort of a thing where you see kind of parallels with this today, where you have a lot of white Christian men who are military men, and they will be sent to faraway places to either kill other white men or to decimate some of the brown people around there, or to try to train brown people how to be a policeman or something along those lines. And they would definitely consider themselves Christian. People in the name of Christianity do very many warlike activities. And it could be a situation where that is among themselves the unspoken part of Christianity, where we accept these people, we like these people, they are expanding the empire, they are the people, they are like our missionaries, they are spreading our people and spreading our beliefs. So it could be an unspoken sort of high ranking, high status activity for the people who are engaged in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's a very central theme. This idea of isolating yourself from your family and pretty much in a situation of going into death without your children, your spouse, your forebears, because you see it reflected in the idea of monasteries and convents. The most holy, the most pure, the most close to Christ and God are those who have forsaken having a family. Pursuing the biological need to procreate and continue your line. These people are held up as holy. Virginity is considered the most virtuous thing, and you saw this all the way up until the 1960s with the idea of what it is to be pure. And this isn't to besmirch the idea of preserving your virginity. It's how long do you preserve it? You'll have somebody go to a nunnery and become a nun, or you'll have a man go become a monk, and they're supposed to uphold this idea of absolute virtuousness, because to indulge in a carnal lust is to be degenerate. So this revolves around this idea that the highest achievement in God's eyes is to remain celibate and isolated. And converts are ultimately lured away from their families to join convents and monasteries, or in the more modern forms, missionary work, or even you can extend this to uh, going to war. And I say that particularly because a lot of the overseas wars, for instance, the United States fights now, are at the behest of Israel, at the behest of Jerusalem, the Holy Land of all three Abrahamic faiths. It's at the behest of the lands that their God had genocided for the sake of Jewish occupation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Also, Christ, in which Christianity's name is based on, is for Christos, or also was the term that both Christians and Jews use, which is the Messiah, or how they might say like Mashiach or something like that. But for them in the past, that person was a political and spiritual leader who was meant to be a conqueror for them. So it's sort of in line with the more unspoken ideals of Christians. It's the ones that they wouldn't talk about. It's like, for example, growing up in a Christian family, I never heard them talk about how Christians became so successful, how they were able to spread and thrive and flourish. None of that was ever talked about. Only the sort of pious stuff. And like you mentioned with the priests and nuns, I was told the story. I was told the story that they are a pious person who forgoes the carnal pleasures. And the funny thing about that is it's almost impossible. People just instinctually feel these lusts, for better or for worse sometimes, and they just feel them, and you have no control over it. It's purely instinctual. So it's kind of funny that you would put somebody in a position to kind of forego their basic animal functions in life, like procreation and sex, and ask them to put that aside. You're going to rise above your biology, even though you're a biological creature. You're going to rise above that, and you're going to be a servant of the Messiah,
Yeah, and it also goes against the grain of the idea that, well, Christianity it's based on the natural laws of things. Well, if that's the case, then how come the purest and closest to God, and those we ought to revere the most, are the ones who are refusing to continue their familial lines, who are refusing to do what's natural, refusing to take part in their own biological best interest? So, I mean, it doesn't even hold water when you look at it from that view.
Well, also, if someone has dedicated themselves, to having an appearance of not procreating, can that person, with a straight face and genuinely encourage you to have a family for yourself? Do you know what I mean? Like, would that awaken any cognitive dissonance? Like, I'm devoted to the Christ, but for you, I think that you should, concern yourself with being a good family man. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. But I think you also got to take into perspective the idea of some holy water will make everything right, or confessing your sins will make everything right. On top of the Christian belief that we're all born into sin, we're all sinners, and we all must confess our sins to Christ if we want to get into heaven, and that again puts these people who have foregone their own family lines as the gatekeepers for everybody else. And if you look at just in general how Christians, specifically Catholics, tend to look at children. There's almost a degree of disgust or inconvenience, and this is something that's reflected in modern society on a political level, a socioeconomic and political level as well.
Yeah, and just to kind of tie this back to the timeline a bit, there's a bit of a contradiction in the histories, in the official histories here, which was that there was the Roman imperial cult, and then that was transitioned. That they took those priests associated, priests and priestesses associated with that, and transformed them into the new Christian religion. Now, a lot of the things from the timeline are talking about the sort of new Christians wiping out the old pagans, and so I just wanted to kind of point out that contradiction, that the imperial cult or imperial cults that were there before, they may not have been spared in the process either. And it's kind of interesting that that they persecute these people, coming up with names like magician or soothsayer or these sorcerer and things along those lines. The Old Testament in the Christian Bible says that is an offense punishable by stoning. But when you kind of look at a lot of these religious communities, they can be pretty diverse, with sex kind of getting away from the norm. You know how you have like the idea of the esoteric and exoteric parts of the religion. Well, the secret parts of it are almost always like sorcerers to the more general public. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's the exact same thing, and they could explain it away by God's providence, or all I have to do is confess these sins and all is forgiven, or some holy water on the forehead or something. There's always a scapegoat with it. There's always some excuse to get around the contradiction and the hypocrisy of it.
Yeah, and also if you have this idea that you should be consistent in your messages, for example, if you're the type of person that you want to have, a consistent story, a consistent view of yourself and the society and stuff like that, imagine being somebody who doesn't have any concern about that, right? And that would be more like the average person. The consistency of whatever they're talking about doesn't matter because they don't remember what they were just talking about a few days before. So having a consistent story is not relevant to the average person. And I want to say that is probably a very large appeal for people kind of caught in these mass movements. It's like, ooh, shiny, and they kind of just throw themselves into it. I'm just gonna believe my family all of a sudden because this traveling thing is coming through town. And that type of person who throws themselves into these mass movements willy-nilly that way is a particular type of person, and I don't think that consistency appeals to them in any of this. So I just wanted to put that out there. Like, I want to talk about like the mindset of how people can get caught up in this stuff. Like if a bunch of guys roll through your town, a bunch of hot guys or hot females roll through your town, and they're changing everything. Is that going to have a certain appeal and draw to people? I think so.
Yeah, and it goes back to a modern anecdote that you hear. A goldfish has a 8-second memory or a 1 minute. A very short memory is the summation of the anecdote, and it applies to, like you said, the most common people, the white masses. I would argue the exception of my wife because she remembers things that I said verbatim several years ago. But that aside, it again ties back to the worldview and theology that you kind of alleviate yourself of this consistency because it pushes everything towards the later. The idea of eternal paradise after you die. It's pushing everything to after you die, and any problems now. The next generation can worry about it. I'll be sipping wine with Jesus in heaven. It lends itself back to just putting it off to later. This procrastination mentality that applies to even what somebody said a few days ago. Well, I won't need to remember it. It's worry about it later.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And by the way, Grimvera, talking about that is probably going to get you labeled a magician. Okay? So just, be aware of that. But it's a very, very fascinating thing to me of throwing labels on people like magician. It's kind of like the modern one they have, which is racist, where you have just like hordes. And what I mean by that, like hordes, just vast groups of people who are ready, willing, and able to just hurl insults and attacks on others. But the one of the differences is they can't just get together in a group and just club somebody. Because people have guns now, and people have pretty nice lives relative to the past. They've got their TV, they've got all this, all their stuff. I don't think it's like people retained like the stupidity and bestial nature. However, they are in like a sweet air conditioned house with a TV, and I just don't think that somebody in that position is going to want to easily lend themselves to a mass movement and go club people who are racist. You know what I mean? Not
A-
all.
Antifa and Black Lives Matter would definitely be a testament to that, I think.
Yeah, the exceptions.
But yeah, it's the idiot box television culture, the luxury culture. It's again goes right back to this. Well, I'll worry about it later. You see the rise of televangelists and people tuning in and hanging on every word that a celebrity says or an online preacher says. It's refusing to take self responsibility. You're deferring everything to what ultimately amounts to a faceless outside party. Spiritually, you outsource everything to this faceless, omnipotent, omnipresent, omnipowerful God to handle for you on the social and economic level. You defer everything to this faceless, omnipotent, omnipowerful, omnipresent state, and collect your welfare checks and your food stamps. And for any kind of opinion or agency outside of the other two, you defer to these faceless news organizations or massive online groups or social media. It always comes back to this idea of just offloading all of your worries, all of your concerns on something that is distant and impersonal and ultimately doesn't give a whit about what you want. And this is something you also see reflected with domestic policies in many Western countries. This mandatory education that is more often than not deferred to public education and Catholic schools, private schools. It's something that's kind of all over our culture, our mentality, spirituality, and it all, I think it does all wrap back around to the spiritual worldview at the heart of Abrahamism overall, but as it concerns us, Christianity.
Yeah, yeah. Just to touch on what you said about kind of living for the next life, or kind of living life as if the body you have and the nature around you is kind of secondary or tertiary, even. That is a very popular mindset that has been going on for a very long time, where people kind of prefer to talk about their stories that are just part of their mind, rather, or even a collective sort of collective delusion is also a common one. But people prefer more to bond over these fantasy genres and fantasy events and things like that. For example, if you look at if you look at a modern phenomenon like Harry Potter, or other sort of fantasy things like Lord of the Rings is another one. People like that, if you go look at them, I've been to like one of the cons myself, nerd alert, and it was cool to be there. I saw I saw a lot of I saw a lot of the stars that I'd seen on TV. Is kind of cool to see, but it is a goofy, dorky bunch of people wearing, some in costumes and others just buying trinkets and stuff like that. And that type of person you could rarely motivate to get out of the house, probably. But they're going to go there and they're going to joust with one another, or they're going to there were guys, mostly just white guys, engaging in sword fights with these kind of foam swords, and I thought that was great, but it is very difficult to get people motivated to do something other than just passively consume entertainment. It's just very difficult to get people back into the real world. That we're really competing with a whole fantasy universe that people have and that they have been living in for hundreds of years. And that is what we're awakening to. But I also wanted to touch on something. You were talking about the televangelist. You were talking about these very like one leader, large movements, mass movements centered around a person. And you could see that kind of within our group and our movement, it is distributed. We don't all look to one person. Everybody that I've spoken to within, white nationalists and etc., would have a whole list of people that they listen to and that they read and that they would consider all equally wonderful. And I wanted to contrast that we don't have a culture within our movement of passively consuming entertainments passed from on high. Most people in our movement are all active and engaged in some way. It's not like, I can't sit down and listen to someone kind of go over the JQ or the history of our people, or for example, like with Siege. I can't go through that and then just come out of it thinking like, oh well, that was nice, that was a fun movie to watch or something like that. No, I feel motivated afterwards to do something. I feel motivated to discuss this. And so I just wanted to kind of put that in there and kind of contrast what we're all doing with other sorts of groups and movements.
Yeah, I see your points there, but I think the lack of centralization also comes from several disagreements within our movement as a whole. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, because, if everybody just agreed on everything all the time, then we'd end right back up where we are now. But you can't take it too far in the other direction either. For instance, there's very distinct theological differences between different camps in the greater white nationalist movement. You have, a lot of people.
Yeah, there sure is.
A lot of people, particularly from what I've seen in the National Socialist side of things, the quote unquote the neo-Nazis, where they are very pro-Christian, and I've seen some that even go to the point of putting their Christianity before their own kin, before white people. They put religion before race. And then on the other side, you have the Volkish pagans, and I'm not saying none of them put faith before race, because you can get carried away in that direction too, but these differences do exist, and I think that's one reason you have this disassociation between various groups. And then there's also, of course, those who get overly paranoid about who's really a Jewish shill. I've seen so many prominent white nationalist personalities accused of being, Jewish shills, and entire arguments erupt over whether or not they are.
You're not making it in our movement unless you're accused of being a shill a few times a day.
Right. I've been accused of being a shill, and let's face it. At this point in time, I'm a nobody. But it's dispersed for several reasons, good and bad. And I think that to a degree, there does have to be a unification a little bit more. And hashtag trigger warning on this. This is going to piss people off. I think a large part of that would inherently have to do with shrugging off Christianity, or at least the parts of it that are directly relatable to the Abrahamic sphere altogether, because we require a shift in worldview to avoid repeating the same mistakes that we made in this current society, with the welfare state and putting everything off on Big Brother and whatnot. It'll require a complete shift, and I think that the solution to that is more of the polytheistic trend of things, and this idea of the reincarnation of oneself in future generations, because that shifts your entire worldview from one of postmortem paradise to one of bettering what we have here for the future, because we will die, but we will come back as our grandchildren or great grandchildren, and we want to leave them and ourselves something better. So it puts us back into a sphere of a social interest, a theological interest, a societal interest, and a biological interest of taking care of the now for the sake of the future.
Yeah, that is a really wonderful thing to think about, is how can we improve things for the future generations. And I hope that we can, through our show and whatever whatever thing that we're engaged in. I hope that we can do that. But that's not really on the radar of a lot of people, of actually the doing part of that, having the sentiment about the children are the future. A lot of people have that sentiment, but they don't really act on it in a way that benefits the children. And it's a difficult thing to think about. But yeah, an analogy I heard once was, the men who are in the front and they're exploring a new area. And sometimes they've got to use their machetes to cut through thick, tangles, so that they can get through an area to the next area. Well, I I would hope that we are serving part of that function, that we are cutting away some of the problem areas, or we're talking about something that somebody else doesn't want to talk about, or we're making something that was, maybe people had a vague notion about what was going on, but we made it more concrete. Hopefully we can serve that function. And I think that as far as free speech goes and our political interests, that if we can carve a larger space for people to get through, that ultimately that will be a great thing.
Yeah, it's again wrapping all back around to the worldview. You base everything on your inherent worldview and the theological structure that underlies that. I mean, that's where we get all of our more tales of morality, or if you want to put it in the scope of honor, that too. It all comes back to the spiritual root of things. So if you take all these issues and you have, say, 3 ropes, one representing your culture, your civilization, another one representing your daily function in life, how you conduct yourself, how you behave, and the third one being your theology, they all have to be consistent. They are all woven together. And for instance, if you weave all of them together and you remove the theology, the braid will fall apart. And this is, you can go back to the Western world that is quote unquote Christendom, all these things, all these institutions that are built on Christian values, help thy neighbor with the welfare system, and all these ideas of democracy and these things that, a lot of white nationalists will probably agree are poisonous. You remove that and you come to this question of, why am I trying to defend this society that is so sick and so poisoned? Why am I trying to defend what ultimately is these institutions that are causing all these problems that I'm fighting to begin with?
Mm. Yeah, and I think that we wouldn't want to fight to to undermine the youth or the people who will come after us. That I think that probably the best we could do is to catalog what was working and what wasn't, what was helping us gain victories over our enemies, and then what was not. For example, I see a lot of people repeating a lot of mistakes mentioned in Siege all the time. I see a lot of people not heeding the warnings from 100 years ago or more from Henry Ford and the Dearborn Independent when they wrote the International Jew. Through my lifetime, I've seen people repeat and repeat all these things that happened before, and it really is true that if you don't know the history, that you're doomed to repeat it. It is absolutely the case. And even with many of us knowing, we can stop for ourselves, but we can't stop other people from destroying themselves via their ignorance or their naivete. I don't know how to really understand this this one part, from the histories where you have the Jews and the Christians, and the Jews are kind of embedded in their enclave with, in certain areas of the Christian civilization. I believe that there is a symbiosis going on with them, but the Jews do not like the Christians at all, and they have nothing but bad things to say about them. But it's the reverse for many Christians, that they are inviting them to come have their enclave, they fight for a lot of Jewish causes. They invite Jewish leaders to have their say politically, and these two groups together, they may not appear. On the surface, they may not appear like one another, but I do believe that it's true that they have formed a symbiosis. Even if one side hates the other, even if one side deifies the other, then it doesn't matter what they say. It just matters what they do, and what they are doing is using their collective power for a lot of stupid stuff that's harming the society as a whole. And so, yeah, we can't preserve that part. But that kind of symbiosis has been going on for centuries, as far as we could tell.
Yeah, it's kind of like the idea of a master that beats his dog, but his dog still loves him. And this is something that goes all the way back. And I'll point out it's on the timeline too. But as early as 407 AD, and it might have been before this as well, but 407 AD is where you see it particularly noted that they enforce edicts that ban worship that is non-Christian, with the exception of Judaism, which is allowed to continue. And this is something that you see happen again, less than 4 decades later. When Theodosius II declares that all heretics and pagans should be put to death, but he gives a pass to Judaism and decrees it a legal non-Christian religion. This is something that's been repeated over and over and over again. I mean, you hear many white nationalists constantly repeating how many times Jews have been kicked out of European countries, and it ranges anywhere between like 109 to like 314 or something like that. And it's because of this dog loving the master who beats it mentality. They keep letting them back in because Christianity loves them some Jews, but it doesn't work the other way around. And it's starting to be repeated with Islam, because you'll have Christians will let in Jews, and then Jews will be at the forefront of telling them to allow Muslims and be tolerant of Muslims. Even though Muslims kill Christians and Jews in the Middle East, let them in anyway. And you see Christendom get destroyed, and the curious thing is Christianity seems all too happy to let it happen.
It is. And I wonder if maybe the Jews haven't chosen a different group to go with their symbiotic relationship. Maybe they've chosen other people to do the kind of stuff that Christians are no longer able or willing to do.
No, I don't know, because they still like to use Christian nations as their attack dogs in the Middle East. But I think it's a structure of Christianity's inherent submissiveness to this higher power, and in this case, the higher power is, lo and behold, the same God the Jews worship. This subservience and bending knee, turning the other cheek, being essentially a beta, a beta male or a beta female. Don't procreate, don't fight back. Unless, of course, you're fighting back against pagans, but don't fight against Jews. And then you have Islam, which is rabidly militaristic, being encouraged by Jews to go into European lands and essentially take advantage of all these good subservient Christians.
Yeah, and it is weird how sometimes they'll do that, and then they'll just be kind of shocked and appalled that they're being attacked by Muslims, that the Jews are being attacked by Muslims in European cities, and they've issued they've issued warnings to one another about the rising anti-Semitism from them inviting in all these hostile Africans and stuff like that. And it's like I sort of understand. I sort of understand where they're coming from. It's part of their greater strategy, and I think they're willing to accept that a few people, get punched or graffitied or whatever, in order for them to kind of achieve their larger goal. Or if it drives Jews out of Europe and into Israel, then that's also fine as well. I don't know. I don't know what percentage of Jews are in Israel, but I don't know. What are they going to do? Who are they going to leech on over there? Does the American politician are they forever going to be at the beck and call of Israel, giving their pledge to Israel like they do?
I think the only way that will ever stop is if Abrahamism as a whole is driven at least back into the Middle East where it belongs, if not completely done away with altogether. Because
yeah,
like we've pointed out, Christianity just can't seem to separate itself from Israel. And I'm sure Christians will come up with all kinds of excuses for it, but the historical evidence is there, the biblical evidence is there, and so if you shift away from that subservient, procrastinating worldview that Christianity has, and its place in the larger scheme of things with Abrahamism, and you move towards, again, the idea of cyclical, reincarnation and living in the now, working to better the world now for the sake of the future, and the idea of honor, which isn't just about telling the truth and being able to bench press. It goes back to personal integrity and what you leave for your family down the road. This idea of honor. Well, will you continue to defend your family? Will you continue to defend, your biological kin? Will you continue to fight for your people, or will you go back to this spiritual default of trying to be friendly with somebody who uses you and beats you? It's an abusive relationship. Is essentially what Christianity is in with Judaism. It's a very abusive. It's the exact same thing of a master who beats his dog and the dog still wags his tail when the master comes home, or the good subservient wife who gets beaten by her husband but sticks with him nonetheless and tries to deny over and over again that he's a bad person.
Yeah, well, how much information do these people need to go fight so fervently for their causes? Well, usually the person who is who's going to be involved in these mass movements, who is going to be fighting this or that thing. I grew up with a lot of those guys from school who went away to the military, and I could scarcely get a deep conversation out of anyone from high school, including those guys. So it's like, people don't go away to war and they don't fight this or that thing knowing what they're doing. It's a fascinating part of life, but so too could be what draws people to various faiths, including Christianity. That it could just be historical inertia. You just people around you do that, and so you do it. There's a sort of very strong monkey see, monkey do sort of nature to human beings, and yeah. So if the popular thing is go be a goy and fight for Israel, then they just do it, and people are rewarded for this thing. I had guys telling me from high school that they were maybe working at a pizza shop or maybe they were working at McDonald's, but they were talking with the military, and the military was going to give them between $10,000 and $25,000 to join. And they started seeing in their mind like, ooh, I could probably get a motorcycle now, and stuff like that. That's who they want to get to fight against us. That's who they want to get to fight against anyone who goes against their the power structures. They're not getting people who know what they're getting into. They're not getting people who know the history. And so I just wanted to put that out there as something to kind of ponder, that for a lot of people to kind of consider our interests, white interests, and consider our politics, it sometimes can take them years to kind of come around to our side and think like, oh yeah, I guess I am part of this race, and yeah, maybe we do have racial interests. It could take somebody years, but it could only take a few weeks for a man coming out of high school to join the military, go away, and do some dastardly thing. We don't even know the half of it. We don't know how many local prostitutes that they have around their military bases. We don't know how many illegitimate children have been parented because these guys just go knock up some brown people out in the Philippines or wherever it is that they're going. It doesn't matter to them. They just know that they've got my dick, and they've got to get it wet. And that's where most people are at. You and I, Grimvera, we are on kind of a different level. We're talking about we're talking about some of these ideas, and the people in the audience are the same way. They're going to probably they're going to think more deeply. They're the type of person who could probably confirm a lot of the things that we're talking about. That that's true. I have probably seen some people just get involved with the mass movement, and there's a lot of appeal there. And I wanted to mention that there's a lot of pay and resources for kind of going along with the rulers. And, there's going against the grain doesn't usually get you a lot of, it doesn't give you a lot of money. It could make you popular with certain segments of people who also prefer to think. But I'd also like to ask you and the audience to consider, it's to what degree would it be appropriate for us to have a bolder and more warlike and more realistic view on the world? What do you think?
I think it would probably do us a lot of good, but with the big caveat of Judaism got to go, and I personally would extend it to Abrahamism. It's got to go. But yeah, it's an instance where we need to learn to be more autonomous from the larger, the global multi-cult. We're so dependent on the rise and fall of economic numbers and popularity numbers of specific individuals, and you see people joining this big fight to preserve their comfort level. Essentially, I think that's what it ultimately boils back to for a lot of people, is their comfort level. Well, just imagine if you stopped sitting there and hanging on every word somebody like Mark Collette, sorry, says. I mean, I like the guy. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I think he's got a lot of good points. But take it beyond what he says about going to the gym and working out and finding a woman at the gym, and extend it to um, just doing away with some of these comfort level things. Like, you don't have to go to a gym to get fit. You can do it at home, and the more autonomous you become, the less you'll have to rely on things like, going to work to earn enough money to afford the gym membership to go work out and possibly look good in front of a woman who likewise has to get a job in order to pay for her gym membership. Go cut wood. Live in a house with a wood stove. Live in a house with a root cellar. Even give up some of these luxuries, and you'll find a lot of these things that the alt-right pushes as things that we must do, better ourselves physically and mentally. They'll come naturally. You don't need, you know, the big car or the big TV, or to be absolutely, cut with chiseled abs, because Europeans, especially Northern Europeans, were designed to have a little bit of that fat on us. But overall, you can get a physique from just going out and living with a degree of hardship, stepping beyond your comfort level, and stop hanging on the absolute gospel of what any given e-celebrity says, no matter how right or wrong they may be in the overall scheme of things.
Yeah, that is really important, and as far as I could tell, it's at least a stated value in Christianity and paganism that you have your free will, and you're supposed to be able to use it. Now, I know that in Christianity there's also contradictions that you should just kind of follow along. That's it's kind of part of it. That you could be told that you have free will one minute, and then you could be told to just go along to get along the next. But you can, and I think it is encouraged in what from what I've seen from paganism, that you do not necessarily have to worship the gods, that they are held in reverence, but they are kind of like a part of us in a way that you don't have to hold aloft the deities to all important, all encompassing things. And beyond that, if you want to have if people out there want to have some kind of level of fitness, it involves thought, like anything else. It's like, if you want to if you want to be good at any particular type of activity, you have to use your mind to be able to do it. If you want to be able to talk about white nationalism, you will probably want to get versed on history. Where have we come from? Where are we going with this? The same thing, like if you want to become a good chemist, you've got to start somewhere. And I think that is it's a fascinating thing that with our movement, there does seem to be a very high bar for entry, where people don't usually come around to our position very quickly, but then they are willing to kind of throw themselves into a lot of other things willy-nilly. Yeah, people would more easily get married to a psychopath than they would consider our racial interests. You know what I mean? Like, people will throw away their entire life and in an instant. But for considering our politics and the politics of our people, almost impossible for a lot of people. And I just find that to be an interesting thing, and I wonder what's going to develop from that, if we truly are going to kind of split away and become a different people altogether.
It's hard to speculate on what happens, but about raising, having a high bar. I don't want people to think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, having a high bar is how you get the cream of the crop. It's if you have a low standard, then you end up with the same uh, dipshits and genetic dead ends that we'd rather see just gone away with. And this is where actually my sentiments towards men going their own way and incels has kind of changed a little bit as I've thought about this more and more and more. Because before, I was like, oh, you can go out, you can do it. Now I'm saying, prove it. And if you want to continue to try to just be an incel or a man going your own way, well, good riddance. You beta. It's
Yeah.
it's harsh.
Yeah,
But
there does seem to there does seem to be a lot of negativity directed at those kind of groups who have kind of taken themselves away from the general society. It's for women, they don't like them because they're not giving them attention and resources, and for men, it gives them kind of an excuse to ridicule them. But also, there's a serious lack of brotherhood in the world, that where men do not back each other up. I heard some guys, probably the MGTOW type of guys, talking about, well, are we, how would we ever reinstitute coverture, which was like an old fashioned thing where you owned your wife and children as property or something like that. And I was just saying, like, look, guys, I was like, we are so far away from that, because you would have to have an actual community, a community of men who did not permit, collectively did not permit their wives to do certain things. And I was like, you guys are so far away from that and so soft that should not even be something that you're considering. That is so fringe compared to what you're capable of. It's like you gotta get to something more realistic for our people. It's just funny that people kind of go to a lot of the edge. People are attracted to things on the edge, but I think too often it's a distraction from what really could be important for that person, what could really kind of serve them throughout their life. But there are a lot of ways that people can get involved in various mass movements to get themselves destroyed, and often it's mostly their children who have to suffer the consequences. It's not usually that person, like that alcoholic, or those people who just fornicate one another and make an illegitimate kid. It's not them who usually have to suffer it. It's usually the child who has to suffer the consequences the most. And rarely some shining lights of humanity rise in order to they kind of rise from the mess of humanity to kind of give us a picture of what life is really like and what it could be like. And those are the types of people that I admire, that even through all this chaos in the world, that they can shine like a laser through all the BS to what is really important.
yeah, yeah, and a lot of these things that you mentioned, like people going out and having illegitimate children, or people who don't give a damn about their family, people that sit on the couch and watch TV, or focus more on their favorite sports team or whatever else, or even people who go out and work out like fanatically, the people who are 300 pounds of just raw pure muscle with like 2% body fat or whatever, they're adding to the problem. If you restore everything back to the family unit and the uh, biologically coherent community unit. You will have children being educated by their parents. You'll have this bond restored between parent and child via this education. They'll be with their child, teaching them these things that are currently outsourced to schools. And these children will, in turn, get an idea of what it is to be a strong man, an alpha male, what it is to be an alpha female, what it is to be a relevant, good person, and what it takes to continue living good and to make sure their children live good. Because it's you can say, oh well, that guy's alpha, and point out some muscle head at the gym, but I would call the man that's even more alpha the guy who goes out and gets ripped, growing his own food so he doesn't have to rely on making that bit of extra money to keep up with inflating prices of groceries.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And as we are coming to our conclusion here, I wanted to ask, by your research into the history, and kind of going through the chronology of these Christian events, what kind of stands out to you as the kind of danger that we as modern people face from Christians? What kind of things could we be labeled? Could we be attacked by the Christians, and how do you think they will do it? What do you see coming from this?
It'll probably be the same tactics that you've always seen from Abrahamic religions, and I've seen a few people. They're more of the absolute psychotic Deus Vult types that say that anybody who doesn't believe in Christ the Savior ought to be burned as a heretic. I don't know if it's they just get caught up in that Inquisitor fantasy, or if they like Warhammer 40k a little too much. But you see that sentiment amongst a few. I'm not saying it's the majority. Certainly isn't. But it would likely come in the form of state enforced religion, like you saw with Rome before it splintered and fell apart, and like you see with even some fascist countries through history and the like. It'll be enforced theology in the name of upholding Christendom, not necessarily white cultures and white people, but the coherency of Christendom. And I think that's the biggest threat, is them kind of using lawfare, using the law to continue to persecute anybody who isn't Christian, rather than people who aren't white and looking out for white interests in white countries.
Well, I really appreciate that, and I think that brings us to a conclusion here about our on our sorcery for today. But thank you so much for that, and also I wanted to tell people that we've got some really great blog posts out there that we've been writing on the for the website. So if you want to kind of get an interesting perspective on some of the things going on, or some of the things from history, drop by there, and that's a really great resource. And if you haven't seen the site, we also put the podcasts on there as well, so you could listen from the site if you are kind of like worried about YouTube and kind of wondering where that's going. We're going to be posting it on our website. And the only other thing that I wanted to say was, please drop by our donate page and drop us a tip. We prefer crypto, but we also take PayPal. So anyway, really appreciate to the people who do go and donate. Is there anything else you want to say before we go, Grimvera?
Not really anything, except thanks for listening. And by the way, the website is madotmedia.com.
All right. Well, thanks so much, everybody, and take care.